So I'm Erickson, and I was asked to tell what my relationship with Esalen was and how it started. I did a month-long workshop here in 1975. I was stationed in Big Sur as a forest ranger at the time, and I took a group called the Inner Road to Health that was done by Al Drucker, and Dick Price came in to do the process parts of that group, and that's how I got to meet him. So after that group was over, Dick and Al sat me down on the deck and said, we've always known that a ranger lived next door, but we've never had a relationship with him. So if you're interested, we'd like to put you on a special guest list, and you can come and go as you want. And so that began my sort of ongoing relationship with Esalen. And I took advantage of their offer. I eventually became one of Al Drucker's students in deep tissue work. And I became part of the deep tissue crew here in the late 70s. And eventually became one of Dick Price's students. Beginning in the early 80s. I was a hiking partner of Dick's and took part in many of the ongoing Gestalt groups that he offered, and used to watch him do open seats and do personal work with him. So that began my relationship with Gestalt and my relationship with Dick, which was ongoing until the time of his death in 1985. I eventually went back to school and got a master's degree in counseling, and then went back to school further and got a PhD in psychology. So the other question that I think you were concerned with was how I view the evolution of Gestalt at Esalen and kind of the changes from when Fritz was here. And one way to look at that is, by the time Fritz got to Esalen, he really wasn't working with people much in an ongoing way. He was mainly doing public demonstration sessions. So the work as it was done by Fritz was always in front of a group. That's not always the way that Fritz had worked, but it's the way he worked at Esalen. I think that eventually sort of became known as West Coast Gestalt, a more theatrical style of work in which there was an audience and Fritz and his quote-unquote patient. Fritz died in 71, I believe. It's either 70 or 71, I can't remember now, but one of the two. And at the time of his death, he was sort of willing to hand off to Dick Price the Gestalt that was going to be taught at Esalen, because he'd moved up to Canada to Lake Cowichan shortly before his death and actually had left Esalen. And Dick changed Gestalt to fit a more personal style. Dick used to say there were two kinds of Gestaltists, the acid Gestaltist and Aikido Gestaltist. He classified himself as the latter. And what he used to say is, people that emulated Fritz liked to frustrate people, and Dick assumed that people frustrated themselves enough already and that he didn't need to do that. So really what he did was soften Gestalt a lot. Although he would never use the words I'm about to use, I think Dick's concern, largely because of his own history, was that everyone has the right to a subjective reality that's not judged from the outside. And so he was a big validator of people's personal reality because he had grown up in ways that was not true. And in some ways he was giving to other people what he never really got for himself. So that softened Gestalt a lot, and he wasn't much of a showman by his own admission and wasn't much interested in that. And what he used to say is he could stay with people a lot longer than Fritz would, and gave more permission in a particular way. And that's how he would phrase it. In his work, there was more permission, and the work was a lot more meditative, and it focused a lot on what somebody's experience moment to moment was. And then, as Dick worked with people over the years, I think he began to see that there were ongoing patterns that would emerge in people's work. And he was really a smart guy, and he would remember from session to session the themes that people worked with. And he began to evolve a paradigm of his own. He called it message program filter, that was really a kind of soft phraseology for how somebody's experienced is meaningfully organized, having a lot to do with their early history and its impact on their current behavior. And that, I think, began to change his work considerably, because he'd always said that as much as possible, the Gestalt that he did should be done without judgment, without evaluation, and without coercion. But he said he broke his own rules when he came up with this message program filter paradigm. And in essence, The paradigm is about how early parental messages get launched into a program of action that the child does in relation to what the child perceives the parent wants or needs, because safety, security, and survival are at stake. And he thought these things carried through into adulthood as patterns. So it was message program pattern or message program filter pattern. So that, I think, really separated his work from Fritz's. Not only was it more meditative and more permission was given, but there was also an ongoing framework from which to kind of evaluate and look at how somebody's experience was meaningfully organized, that originated in childhood and carried over. And I think I took that ball and ran with it, so that's how I asked Dick once, I said where he got message program filter, and fitting with his own style of not really wanting recognition, he said, oh, you can read about it everywhere, which is true to a certain degree, but actually it was his own creation, a sort of shorthand for how experience is organized. It was very elegant and a very kind of snappy way to put it. And you can read about it everywhere, but nowhere in Gestalt. So it was a kind of an innovation. And that mirrors a lot of what's happened in psychology since. I think Dick was kind of ahead of his time in looking for this, and especially in Gestalt circles. So I've pursued something called intersubjective systems theory, which looks at the same thing. It calls what Dick called message program filter unconscious organizing principles. But it really highlights how experience becomes organized throughout the lifespan. And so the focus of what I do, which I call now Gestalt process, Dick called his work Gestalt practice, is much more focused on how experience is actually organized across the lifespan. And the limitations of the emotional conclusions and convictions people come to, trying to make sense out of often very confusing relational surround that they encounter in childhood. So the emotional conclusions and convictions become repetitive themes or patterns in the organization of experience that we call unconscious organizing principles, which are kind of the equivalent of what Dick used to call message program filter. So that's a very shorthand way of saying how Gestalt evolved at Esalen and sort of how I'm currently participating in it. So contrary to what some people think, Dick was a very wide-read person, and so I know he'd read Kohut, which I think influenced some on his idea of message program filter, but he was pretty wide-read in psychology. But I think something that was similar with Dick as with Fritz is that Dick really didn't work with very many people long-term. He tended to work in open seats and when people were in crisis, and although he'd remember their work, his work was not as focused on doing long-term, say, work once or twice a week with somebody. And when you start doing that, it really changes how you have to look at the person if you're working multiple times a week, and the relationship that you're having with the person becomes much more important than Dick or Fritz ever really acknowledged. And I think the relationships that Dick formed when he worked with people were very strong and very powerful. Myself, I can say it for myself, for sure. But it wasn't the focus, his focus. His focus was on moment-to-moment experience. He had this paradigm message program filter that he'd come back to sort of look at what you were doing. But his focus wasn't on working with people over the long run. And when you start working with people on a long-term basis, say once or twice a week for years, like a year or two, which really wasn't available that much at Esalen, that really forces you to look more closely at how somebody's experience is repetitively and thematically organized. And what I would say about intersubjective systems theory is what a lot of current Gestalt people say, like Lynn Jacobs is one, I'm forgetting some of the others, but I'm certainly not the only Gestalt person who ever figured out that intersubjective system theory might be what Gestalt ever should have probably become if it had kept its allegiance to systems theory, because intersubjective systems theory is a systems theory. Fritz nominally paid allegiance to systems theory, and I know Dick was well read in it, but they didn't talk about it much in the actual work they did with people. And when it's a system, you have to start looking at your impact on the ongoing relationship you're having with somebody. And that's something that both Dick and Fritz didn't spend a lot of time focusing on, especially when they taught. And so I think that's one way that Gestalt has evolved. The other problem that Gestalt, I think, had the way it was taught by Fritz is it really didn't have a developmental theory. It didn't really concern itself with how the problems that you were encountering developed. And so a lot of Gestalt practitioners have said that the trouble with Gestalt was that it didn't have a coherent developmental theory, and didn't pay much attention to that, didn't pay enough attention to the ongoing relationship that was involved when you're working with somebody. And thirdly, didn't pay enough attention to some of the people that Fritz talked about, like Martin Buber, who could have supplemented Gestalt theory in terms of the relationship you were having with people. So a lot of the people who were critical of Fritz in the later years, we're talking about the 80s now, not the 70s or the 60s, started saying that intersubjective systems theory seemed to be a good answer for Gestalt, because they were all theories that were system theory compatible, and they were all sort of focusing on, and intersubjective systems theory focused both on development and on the relationship that was happening between the patient and the client. So I know Lynn Jacobs out of LA wrote a book called The Healing Relationship in Gestalt Therapy, which is a title I don't think Dick or Fritz ever would have come up with. So in my work now, what becomes really important is the relationship and the impact I'm having on somebody. That becomes part of the process. And if you watch movies of Dick or Fritz, that's not something that they focused on in their work with people. And I think it's also part of an evolving paradigm in philosophy and in psychology that can be called postmodern or post-Cartesian. And so what I call Gestalt process tries to be a post-Cartesian, have a post-Cartesian sort of philosophical view. Post-Cartesian means post-Descartes, and sort of beyond the subject-object split that Descartes' philosophy imparts. So his philosophy, I think, therefore I am. As Kurt Lewin once said, that's fine, but the existence of one person implies the existence of another. And so a kind of a relational theme begins to be brought in that way. And so they didn't talk about postmodernism or post-Cartesian philosophy a lot when Dick was around, although there were people here who certainly knew that and talked about it a lot, like Gregory Bateson. So I would say when you place Gestalt more aligned with intersubjective systems theory, which certainly a lot of Gestalt therapists are doing these days, it's an attempt to make Gestalt postmodern and more relational. I think one of the most important parts of Dick Price's work that I certainly learned from him was that he was somebody who believed, although he wouldn't have used this language, that no person has the right to a subjective reality that's more true or more real than another. And that's a very post-Cartesian concept, the idea that reality is always contextual, and that a person's subjective reality is valid and true. And it turns out that that's something you really need when you're working with people, especially with people who are a little more disturbed, for the lack of a better word to call it. So one element that's really important in the work of intersubjective systems theory and the work that I do is to take each person on their own merits, and that really everyone's personal subjective reality evolves out of the history of their experiencing in the world. So when we begin to look at the organization of experience, we're really looking at the concept of figure ground, which is, I think, what unites all of Gestalt. So we're looking at the figure, whatever is going on, in the entire context of a person's experiencing in the world. So that the figure doesn't exist in isolation, which was often a criticism of Fritz's work, but it always exists in relation to the person's whole history of experiencing. And it's the relationship of the figure to the ground that gives meaning. And so we are viewing people, I think, at least in the work that I do, as meaning makers. And the meaning we make out of experience usually makes sense in the context in which it came about, often early childhood, but may or may not be making so much sense today. Although, so what we would say is there are unconscious organizing principles that were formed early in development that remain largely unconscious, which means that a lot of figures don't have a very direct relationship to the ground. So we're always looking at sort of ongoing features of ground instead of the figure in isolation, which is another criticism of Fritz's work that came out in the 80s and 90s. It's something Gordon Wheeler, for example, focused on in his book Gestalt Reconsidered. But in assuming and proposing that no person has a right to a subjective reality that's more valid or more true than another, I think Dick really did attend to that in ways that were very powerful. And perhaps if he'd have lived longer, he might have found intersubjective systems theory useful himself. Because I know a number of his students, Leonard Byrne being another one, have become students of the originators of intersubjective systems theory and very much integrated into the Gestalt work.